The rot reached the seed vaults on the 9th day, and that was the morning Teal Avash stopped believing in rescue. She was 11 seasons old, by the reckoning of her people, the Sumathi, which made her old enough to dig and young enough to still cry while she did it. She stood at the lip of the western terrace with a cutting spade in both hands and watched the gray creep eat the last of the grain. It did not burn the stalks, it did not chew them, it simply touched them, and where it touched, the green went the color of old ash and folded into powder, and the powder fed the gray, and the gray reached a little farther. By the time the second sun cleared the ridge, it had crossed 40 paces of irrigated terrace. By the time her mother called her in, it had crossed 80. Her world was named Sumath in the old tongue and Holdfast on the colony charts, and it was dying the way a body dies when the heart is still beating and the skin is already cold. They called the gray the Unmaking. The scholars in the dome had a longer name for it, full of cliques and qualifiers, but the diggers and the water tenders and the children all called it the Unmaking, because that was what it did. It did not kill. Killing left a body. The Unmaking left nothing. A grazer caught at the field's edge did not fall and rot. It thinned. It grayed. It came apart into the dust that fed the spreading edge, and 3 breaths later there was no grazer, and no bones, and no memory of a grazer, except the screaming, which the gray did not take, because the gray had no use for sound. Teal had heard a great deal of screaming in 9 days. The colony had 11,400 souls when the Unmaking came down out of the northern waste, carried, the scholars said, on a wind that should have been harmless. 3 colonies on the southern continent had already gone silent before Holdfast even understood what it was looking at. By the 9th day, the count of the living was somewhere under 6,000, and no one was counting anymore, because counting meant standing still, and standing still was how the gray caught you. Her mother pulled her through the airlock of the central dome and sealed it, though everyone knew by now that seals meant nothing. The gray did not need a door. It needed only contact, and contact it found, through cracks, through filters, through the small unwatched places where the dome met the ground. The dome bought time. It did not buy safety. Nothing bought safety. The colony elders had stopped pretending otherwise on the 7th day, when the Unmaking took the eastern Habring with everyone still inside it, and the only thing that came out over the comm was a single voice saying the floor is going gray, the floor is going gray, and then nothing. She had watched it take her friend Senna on the 6th day, and she did not let herself think about that, because thinking about it made her hands shake too hard to dig. Senna had been on the eastern terrace when the gray came up faster than anyone expected, a sudden surge from a crack in the soil that no one had marked, and Senna had been a digger like Teal, quick and small and laughing even on the bad days, and the gray had reached her ankle, and Senna had not even had time to scream properly before her foot went to ash, and then her leg, and then there was no Senna, only the gray, fed and reaching, and a cutting spade lying in the dust where a girl had been. Teal had carried that spade back to the dome herself. She had not been able to say why. It was Senna's spade, and Senna was gone, and carrying it had felt like the only thing left that she could do. It still leaned against the wall of the hab she shared with her mother. She looked at it every night and did not let herself cry, because crying used water, and water was scarce, and a digger learned early on a dying world that grief was a luxury the body could not always afford. That was what the Unmaking did to a people. It did not only take the living, it took the room to mourn them. There was no time to bury, no time to grieve, no time even to be afraid in any way that did not end in the gray catching you while you stood still being afraid. The colony of Holdfast had learned, in 9 days, to feel nothing while the worst thing imaginable happened around them, because feeling slowed you down, and slow was how the gray won. The scholars had a word for it that Teal did not know. The diggers had a simpler word. They called it going gray inside, the slow erasure of everything that made a person more than a thing that dug and ran and survived. And by the 9th day half the colony had gone gray inside, and Teal was terrified that she was one of them. Teal sat against the curved inner wall with her knees drawn up and listened to the adults argue about the broadcast. There was a broadcast. That was the thing that kept the dome from simply lying down to die. 11 days ago, before the Unmaking, before any of it, the colony's deep array had caught a signal sweeping the border stars. It was not aimed at them. It was a wide call. A patient, repeating thing, The kind of signal a people leaves running for centuries, in the hope that someone alone and frightened might one day hear it. The message was simple. It gave a frequency. It gave a phrase. It said, in the trade cant that half the galaxy could read, that if you are in the dark, and the dark is winning, speak on this band, and someone will come. It was signed with a name the elders did not recognize, in a script that was not from any of the settled reaches. It was signed, the people of the Third World, the Deathworlders, the ones who answer. Most of the council had wanted to ignore it. Deathworlder was an old slur, a children's tale, a word the reaches used for the kind of species that should not exist. Born on a planet so violent, it killed 9 of every 10 things that tried to live there. A planet of storms and predators and air thick enough to drown in. A furnace world that should have produced nothing but corpses, and instead produced a people who walked out of that furnace and looked at the rest of the galaxy as though it were a quiet room. There were stories. Everyone had heard the stories. Few believed them. Fewer still wanted to owe a debt to creatures out of a story. But on the 4th day of the unmaking, with the southern continent gone and the count falling, an old water tender named Voke Telethi had walked into the council dome, sat down at the deep array, tuned it to the frequency from the broadcast, and spoken the phrase. He had not asked permission. He was 140 seasons old, and he had buried 2 of his 3 children that morning. And he had decided, he said, that pride was a luxury for the living. He spoke the phrase, we are in the dark, and the dark is winning. He gave the colony's position. He gave the count. He described the gray. Then he sat back, and the whole council waited, and for a long time nothing answered but the static of the border stars. Teal had not been in the dome for that. She had been on the terraces, digging fire breaks that did nothing, because the gray was not fire, and did not care about gaps in the soil. But she had heard about it the way children hear about everything, in fragments, from older diggers who repeated it in low voices and did not think she was listening. What she had not heard, what no one had told her, was what came back. Because something had come back. On the 5th day, 11 hours after old Vokuk spoke into the dark, the deep array had lit with a reply. It was short. It was in the same trade cant. It did not waste words. The council had played it twice, and then sealed the recording, because the elders were afraid of what it would do to a colony that had already given up. Teal had not heard it then. She heard it now, on the 9th day, because her mother was on the council, and her mother had stopped believing that protecting children from the truth was a kindness. The recording was 4 seconds long. A voice, flat, calm, neither cruel nor warm, speaking trade cant with an accent no one in the reaches had ever catalogued. It said only this. Hold. We heard you. We are coming. Hold. That was all. No fleet strength. No timeline. No reassurance beyond the one impossible word, repeated like a hand closing around a wrist. Hold. Teal pressed her back against the cold curve of the dome and looked at the gray creeping under the airlock seal in a thin, questing finger, and she did not see how anyone could hold against a thing that unmade the world one pace at a time. The unmaking did not negotiate. It did not feel fear. It could not be killed because it was not alive, not in any sense the scholars could name. It was a process. It was entropy that had learned to want. You did not fight a process. You did not hold against the slow gray erasure of everything you had ever planted, or built, or loved. And yet the word sat in her chest like a stone she could not put down. Hold. She did not know it yet, sitting there with the dust of dead grain on her hands, but 480,000 kilometers above her head, in the cold black just past the second moon, the dark was already beginning to fill with ships. The first sign was not a ship, it was a silence. On the morning of the 10th day, the colony's deep array stopped picking up the background hiss of the border stars. Not faded, stopped. The technician on watch, a thin, nervous Sumathi named Renth, thought the array had failed, and he spent a frantic quarter-hour checking couplings before he understood the truth. The array had not failed. Something very large had moved between Holdfast and the rest of the sky, and it was wide enough and dense enough to swallow the noise of an entire arm of the galaxy. Then the array caught movement, and Renth forgot how to speak. They came out of transit, not in the loose scatter of a survey group or the proud line of a parade, but in a formation the colony's scholars had no name for, Because no one in the settled reaches built fleets that way. Most peoples spread their ships wide, each hull guarding its own slice of sky, because most peoples thought of a fleet as many small fights happening near each other. The Deathworlder fleet did not spread. It clenched. It came in tight, layered, overlapping, every hull's guns covering its neighbor's blind side. A single vast object made of 240 separate ships, moving as though one mind drove all of them at once. It did not drift into the system. It arrived, decelerating from a speed the array could barely measure, shedding velocity the way a hand slaps a table, and the shockwave of its braking lit the upper atmosphere of Holdfast's outer moon in a band of white fire that the diggers on the night terraces saw and mistook, for one beautiful, terrible moment, for dawn. The lead hull was 40 kilometers from prow to stern. The colony did not have a word for a ship 40 kilometers long. The largest vessel the Reaches had ever built was a Velmari treasure barge, and that was 3 kilometers, and it was mostly empty space and gilt. This was not empty. This was 40 kilometers of armor and reactor and gun, dark gray, unlit, marked along its flank with a single sigil in white, a stylized human hand, open, palm out, the universal sign in 100 cultures for both stop and I mean you no harm, depending entirely on who was reading it and how fast the ship behind it was moving. Its name, the array learned when the fleet at last deigned to broadcast its identity, was the Stillwater. It was the flagship of the relief formation the humans called the Open Hand, and it had been built for exactly one purpose, a purpose so strange that the colony scholars argued about the translation for an hour before they accepted it. The Open Hand was a fleet built to go toward things that were dying and pull them back. Not to conquer, not to claim. The humans, it turned out, maintained 9 such formations, scattered along the rim of settled space, each one idling in the dark with reactors warm, and crews aboard, waiting for exactly the kind of signal old Voke Telethy had spoken into the void. They called it answering. They had been answering, the broadcast explained without boast or apology, for 211 of their years, ever since their own homeworld had nearly been lost to something that came down out of the dark and started unmaking it, and no one had come. No one had come for Earth. So Earth had decided that no one would ever again call into the dark and hear only static. That was the philosophy. The colony scholars found it baffling, and the colony elders found it suspicious, and the colony children, when they later heard it, found it the most beautiful thing they had ever been told. But philosophy was not what saved Holdfast. What saved Holdfast was that the Open Hand did not merely believe in answering. It had spent 2 centuries learning, with the grim, methodical patience of a people forged on a world that tried to kill them daily, exactly how to do it. The colony scholars, when they later had the leisure to study the Open Hand, found the whole structure of the fleet baffling in a way that told them a great deal about the people who built it. The Reaches built fleets the way they built everything, for status and for show, the largest hulls in the center, wreathed in gilt and ceremony, the weapons polished, and the crews chosen for bloodline. The Open Hand was built the way a furnace world people built anything they intended to survive, for one purpose, with nothing wasted, every gram of every hull bent toward the single task of reaching a dying world fast and pulling it back whole. There was no guilt, there was no ceremony. The 240 hulls were not even all warships in the sense the Reaches understood. 40 of them were guns, the clenched fist of the formation, the part that killed. The other 200 were something the Reaches had no category for. Hospital hulls, water hulls, soil hulls, hulls packed with synthesizers and binder and seed stock, and the patient, unglamorous machinery of putting a broken world back together. The Open Hand carried 4 times as much rescue as it carried war, and the colony scholars argued for a long time about what that ratio meant, and in the end, old Voco Telethy gave them the answer, the way he gave them most answers, in a single tired sentence. It means, he said, that they would rather save you than kill the thing that hurt you. They will do both, but the saving comes first. That is the whole shape of them, written in the bones of their fleet. The fleet's commander was a woman named Idris Faro, and she was 41 of her years old, and she had answered 11 calls before this one. She did not look like a war god. The scholars, when the first visual feed came through, were almost disappointed. She was not enormous. She did not bristle with weapons. She sat in a plain chair in a plain gray uniform on the bridge of a 40-kilometer warship, and she looked tired. And she looked at the readouts of Holdfast with an expression the Sumathi had no name for, because it was the particular weariness of someone who has seen a great many worlds in exactly this condition, and has never once gotten used to it. Her first act on arriving was not to fire. Her first act was to send down, ahead of any weapon, ahead of any soldier, a single unmanned drop pod, the size of a grain silo, packed with field synthesizers and water reclaimers, and concentrated nutrient stock, and, strapped to the top in a sealed container, that the colony would not understand for hours, 10,000 doses of a compound the humans called the binder. Because the humans, it turned out, knew exactly what the unmaking was. They had seen it before. They had a name for it that was not unmaking, and not the scholar's clicking qualifier. They called it gray rot, and they called the thing that made it the spillage, and they had fought it 8 times in 2 centuries, and they had learned, at a cost the broadcast did not detail, how to stop it. The spillage was not alive. The colony scholars had been right about that, and it had brought them no comfort. It was a self-propagating molecular process, a chain of unmaking that fed on the bonds holding matter together, releasing energy as it broke them, using that energy to break the next bonds, and the next, faster and faster the more it consumed. It had no mind. It had no plan. It was a fire that ate not heat, but structure. And like a fire, it could not be reasoned with, and could not be frightened, and could not be made to stop by anything except the removal of what it fed on. But fire could be starved, fire could be smothered, fire could be cut off from its fuel and left to burn itself out. And the humans, who came from a world where fire was so common that their children learned to handle it before they learned to read, understood fire in their bones, in a way the careful, fireless, climate-perfect peoples of the reaches never had. The binder was the smothering. It was a compound that did not kill the rot. You could not kill a thing that was not alive, but bonded to the broken edges of matter at the gray frontier, and made them, for a crucial span of hours, unbreakable. It froze the fire's advance. It bought time. It turned a thing that spread 80 paces a day into a thing that spread nothing at all, for as long as the binder held. And while the binder held, the open hand did the rest. Teal Avash watched the drop pod come down from the western terrace, because by the 10th day, no one stopped the children from watching anything anymore. It fell out of a sky gone strange and crowded, trailing fire, and it did not crash. 300 meters up, it lit a column of blue-white flame beneath itself, and slowed, gently, impossibly, and settled onto the dead terrace, 40 paces from the gray frontier, as softly as a tired animal lying down. The colony had nothing that could land like that. The colony's own dropships came down hard and proud and broke their landing struts half the time. This thing kissed the ground. Then it opened, and it began, with no one aboard it and no one telling it what to do, to spray a fine white mist along the entire western edge of the unmaking. The gray stopped. Teal saw it stop. She had watched the gray for 9 days, and she had never once seen it stop. Not for water, not for fire, not for the fire breaks the diggers carved in desperation, not for anything. It crossed everything. It crossed 80 paces a day, and now, where the white mist touched it, the questing gray edge simply halted, the way a wave halts at a wall it cannot climb, and it pressed, and it pressed, and it did not advance. She heard herself make a sound she had not made in 9 days. It took her a moment to understand that the sound was a laugh. Around her, on the terraces and in the dome, and along the cracked irrigation channels, the colony of Holdfast began, very slowly, like a body remembering it had not yet died, to make the same sound. It was old Vok Telethi who walked out onto the western terrace first, the 140-season water tender who had spoken the phrase into the dark on the 4th day, and waited 5 days to learn whether anyone had heard. He walked out past the children, past the binder line, to the very edge of the dead gray that was no longer advancing, and he stood there in the light of both suns, and put one trembling hand out toward the frozen frontier, close enough to feel it, not close enough to touch, and he said something that Teal would remember for the rest of her life. He said it not to the colony, and not to the humans, but to the gray itself, to the thing that had taken 2 of his 3 children, and half his world, and his voice, when he said it, was not triumphant. It was almost gentle, the way a person speaks to a thing they have hated so long that the hatred has worn down to something quieter and harder. He said, "You are not the biggest thing in the dark after all." I called, and something bigger heard me. "You should have killed us faster." Then the old water tender turned away from the frozen gray, and he looked up at the 40-kilometer warship hanging in the strange crowded sky, and the colony of Holdfast saw a thing it had not seen from Old Vok in 9 days. They saw him stand up straight. The unmaking had bent everyone on Holdfast, bent them into the hunched, scuttling shapes of people who had learned to feel nothing while the worst thing happened, and Old Vok Telethi, alone at the binder line, straightened out of that shape as though a weight had been lifted off the back of his neck, and the colony, watching him, began one by one to do the same. It was a small thing. It changed nothing about the dead, or the gray waste of the southern continent, or the half of Holdfast that the unmaking had erased. But it was the moment the colony of Holdfast stopped being a thing that was dying, and became, again, a people who were alive. And it happened because a fleet had heard a scream and crossed 40 light-years to answer it, and because one old man had been brave enough, or desperate enough, to scream. But the binder was only the first move, and Idris Pharaoh had not crossed 40 light-years to spray mist and leave. The binder bought time. Time was the rarest thing the colony had, and now they had it, and the open hand spent it the way only a people with 2 centuries of practice could. In the high black above Holdfast, the fleet went to work. The spillage on Holdfast had a source. It always had a source. The rot did not come from nowhere. It spread from a seed, a concentration, a point where the unmaking ran hottest and fastest, and from which the slow gray frontier was fed. The humans had a name for it. They called it the throat. Find the throat, the broadcast explained to the colony's astonished scholars, and you do not have to chase a frontier 80 paces wide across an entire continent. You cut the throat, and the frontier, starved of what feeds it, dies on its own. The throat of the Holdfast spillage was in the northern waste, where the rot had first come down, and the open hand found it in under an hour, because the still water carried sensors that could read the molecular signature of the unmaking from orbit, the way a hunter reads a blood trail, and because Idris Pharaoh had been reading these trails for 19 years. It was buried. Of course it was buried. The throat of a spillage burrowed, sinking into the ground as it consumed, hollowing out a chamber of gray nothing beneath the surface, where the rot ran fastest and shielded itself under 100 meters of stone. You could not reach it from orbit with any ordinary weapon. A bombardment would crack the stone and scatter the rot, and turn one throat into 1,000, and the colony scholars, who had been listening to the human plan with growing dread, said exactly this, expecting to be ignored by the war gods in their 40-kilometer ship. Idris Pharaoh did not ignore them. She agreed with them. That, she said, is exactly why we do not bomb it. What the open hand did instead, the colony would tell its children for 100 years afterward, and the children would not quite believe it, and they would be right not to, because it was not quite believable. They drilled. Not with weapons, with a tool. The Stillwater carried, mounted along its 40-kilometer spine, a single device that was not a gun at all, and the humans called it the Lance, and it was the strangest thing the Reaches had ever seen a warship carry. It did not fire energy. It did not fire mass. It lowered, on a tether of woven monofilament 40 kilometers long, a drill head the size of the colony's central dome, and the drill head was wrapped in the same binder compound that had stopped the rot on the terraces, so that the rot could not eat the drill, and the drill went into the northern waste like a needle into a wound, straight down, through 100 meters of stone, toward the buried throat. It took 4 hours. The colony watched the whole of it on the feed the humans shared without being asked, and for 4 hours, no one on Holdfast slept, and Teal Avash sat in the dome between her mother and Old Vok Telethi, and watched a tether of human filament reach down out of orbit, and drill toward the heart of the thing that had unmade her world. It was not easy work, even for the open hand, and the humans did not pretend it was. Twice during the 4 hours, the rot in the throat surged up the drill shaft faster than the binder could hold, and twice the colony watched a section of the great filament tether begin to gray, and twice the humans answered not with panic, but with a flood of binder pumped down the line under pressure that froze the surge before it could climb. The drill head itself had to be replaced once, lifted 40 kilometers back up to the still water, and swapped for a fresh one, and lowered again. An operation the humans performed in under 20 minutes, with a precision that made the colony's engineers go quiet, because the colony's own machinery broke down for a day every time a single coupling failed, and here were the humans performing surgery on a tether 40 kilometers long, while it was still in the wound. They had done this before. That was the thing the colony felt in its chest, watching. Every move the open hand made had the worn smoothness of a thing done many times, on many worlds, in many throats. And the colony understood that it was watching not a miracle but a craft 2 centuries old, paid for in worlds the humans had reached too late to save, perfected on the bones of every colony that had gone gray before the open hand learned how to choke a throat. A craft, the colony understood, was a more frightening thing than a miracle. A miracle happened once. A craft could be done again, and again, on every world that called, forever. When the drill head reached the throat, it did not blow it up. It capped it. That was the part the children never quite believed. The drill head opened at its tip and released, into the very heart of the gray chamber, a flood of liquid binder under enormous pressure, gallon upon gallon upon gallon, filling the hollow gray throat the way wax fills a mold, bonding every broken edge it touched, freezing the hottest, fastest center of the unmaking solid, in the space of 90 seconds. The throat, smothered from within, choked. The rot, cut off from the seed that fed it, with its molten heart turned to inert stone, had nowhere to draw its energy from. The gray frontier 80 kilometers away, still pressing against the binder line on Teal's western terrace, gave one last questing push. And then it died. Not dramatically, not with fire or sound. The gray simply went still, all of it, all across the dying continent at once. The whole vast frontier of the unmaking stopping in the same breath as the throat that fed it choked shut. And then, slowly, over the following hour, where the binder held it from advancing, and the throat no longer fed it from behind, the gray began to do something the colony had not known it could do. It began to go inert, to crumble, to turn from a hungry questing process into ordinary, harmless, dead gray dust, blowing away on the wind that had carried it, leaving behind the bones and the stone and the gray-scoured earth, ruined, yes, dead, yes, but no longer spreading, no longer eating, no longer unmaking. It was over. Teal was on the western terrace when the frontier died, standing at the binder line where she had stood for an hour, watching the gray press uselessly against the white mist, and she felt the moment it happened, the way you feel a sound stop that you had stopped noticing was there. For 9 days the unmaking had made a sound, not a loud sound, a low sound, almost below hearing, the faint, endless hiss of matter coming apart, the noise of the world being eaten, and the colony of Holdfast had lived inside that sound so long they had forgotten it was there. When the throat choked, the sound stopped. All at once, across the whole dying continent, the hiss of the unmaking simply ceased, and the silence that replaced it was so sudden and so total that Teal's knees nearly buckled, because she had not known, until it stopped, how heavy the sound had been, how much of her body had been bracing against it, every hour of every day for 9 days. The world went quiet, truly quiet, for the first time since the gray came down out of the northern waste, and in that quiet, Teal Avash heard, very far away, a thing she had not heard in 9 days, and had been certain she would never hear again. She heard a bird, one of the small terrace finches that nested in the irrigation channels, that the colony's children had always taken for granted, that had gone silent on the first day of the unmaking, along with everything else that had sense enough to flee or hide. One had survived, somewhere, in some unscoured pocket of the western district, and now that the hiss had stopped, it lifted its small voice into the new silence, and sang, badly, defiantly, a single thin thread of living sound across a continent that had nearly become gray dust. Teal stood at the binder line and listened to a bird sing over the dead gray, and she put both hands over her mouth, and this time, she did not stop herself from crying, because the world was quiet, and a bird was singing, and Holdfast was alive. The colony did not understand, at first, that it was over. They had given up so completely that hope felt like a trick, and they waited for the gray to start again, and it did not start again. They waited an hour. They waited 3. The binder line on the western terrace held. The throat in the northern waste stayed choked. The gray dust blew harmless across the dead fields, and nothing it touched grayed, and nothing it touched unmade, because the fire was out. 11,400 souls had lived on holdfast when the unmaking came. 5,812 were still alive when it stopped. It was not a triumph. The colony scholars were precise people, and they would not call it a triumph, not with half their world dead, and the southern continent a gray waste from horizon to horizon. But it was not extinction, and on the morning of the 10th day, with the rot dead and the binder holding, and a 40-kilometer human warship hanging in the sky like a promise kept, not extinction was a thing so far beyond what any of them had dared hope that the elders wept openly in the council dome and did not care who saw. Teal Avash walked out of the dome onto the western terrace in the light of both suns, and stood at the binder line and looked at the dead, still, harmless gray, and she could not stop her hands from shaking. It was not over, of course. She understood that even at 11 seasons, the throat was choked, but the colony was broken, and a broken colony on a half-dead world had 1,000 ways still to die. Of hunger, of thirst, of the slow despair that comes after the danger passes, and the grief finally has room to arrive. But the humans, it turned out, knew about that too. Because the open hand had not come to choke a throat and leave. They had come, as their 200-year philosophy demanded, to pull a dying thing all the way back. And the second half of what they did for Holdfast, the part that had nothing to do with warships or weapons or the lance, the part that the colony would remember even longer than the day the gray stopped, had not even begun. High above, the still water shifted in its orbit, and 100 smaller hulls broke from the tight clenched formation of the open hand, and began, one after another, to descend toward the wounded world. The first human Teal Avash ever saw up close was a woman who came down out of the sky to fix the water. The colony had expected soldiers. The stories about Deathworlders were all about soldiers, the furnace people, the ones who walked into fire, the ones whose children handled flame before they could read. So when the 100 smaller hulls of the open hand descended and began to land on the dead terraces and the cracked plazas and the open ground outside the dome, the colony braced for an army. What came out of the ships was not an army. It was crews. Work crews, in gray coveralls smeared with the same binder paste that had stopped the rot, carrying tools instead of weapons, moving with the unhurried certainty of people who had done this exact thing on a dozen other ruined worlds and knew precisely where to start. They started with the water, because the humans had a saying, which Teal would learn later, that you cannot grieve and you cannot rebuild until you have had a drink, and a dying colony's reclaimers were always the first thing to fail. The woman who came to the Western District was named Brew Marsh, and she was a hydrologist, which the colony had to have explained to them, because the Sumathi did not have hydrologists. They had water tenders, who tended water that already worked, and they had no profession for the deeper magic of making broken water work again. Brew Marsh was perhaps 30 of her years. She had close-cropped dark hair and forearms ridged with the kind of muscle that came from work, and not from war. And when she climbed out of the drop shuttle onto Teal's terrace and saw the colony's ruined reclamation station, she did not say anything grand. She put her hands on her hips, looked at the dead machinery for a long moment, and said, in careful trade cant, "Well, that's a mess. Let's see what's left." Then she got to work, and Teal, who had nothing else to do and nowhere safer to be, followed her and watched. It was the watching that changed everything. Because the humans, Teal discovered, did not hoard what they knew. The Reaches were old and careful and proud, and in the Reaches, knowledge was wealth and wealth was guarded. A Velmari water tender would no more show a child the inside of a reclaimer than a banker would show a stranger the inside of a vault. Brew Marsh showed everyone everything. When a knot of colony water tenders gathered at a wary distance to watch her work, she did not wave them off, she waved them in. She put the reclaimer's failed coupling in the hands of an old Sumathi tender and walked him through what had broken and why, and when he understood it, when the understanding lit in his face, she grinned at him with a wide flash of square teeth. The colony found human teeth alarming for exactly one day, and then stopped noticing, and said, "There, now you can fix the next one without me. That's the whole point." That's the whole point. Teal heard a human say that, in some form, 100 times over the following days. They did not come to do the work for Holdfast. They came to do the work with Holdfast, and to leave behind a colony that could do the work itself, because the Open Hand had learned over 2 centuries that a world you rescued and left helpless was a world you would have to rescue again. They taught. They taught water and power and soil and binder. They taught the colony scholars how to read the molecular signature of rot, so that if the spillage ever came again, Holdfast would see it on the first day, and not the 9th. They taught the colony's stunned medics things about their own bodies that the Reaches had never bothered to learn, because the Reaches had never needed to fight as hard to stay alive as a people who came from a world that killed 9 of every 10 things that tried. Teal followed Brew Marsh for 4 days, and in 4 days, she learned more about the universe than she had in 11 seasons of digging. She learned that the Grey was not a curse, and not a god, and not a punishment, the things the older diggers had whispered, but a process, a thing with rules, and that a thing with rules could be fought by anyone who learned the rules. She learned that the binder was not magic but chemistry, and that the humans would teach the chemistry to anyone who asked, because a colony that knew the chemistry was a colony that would not need them next time. She learned to read a reclaimer the way Brew Marsh read it, by listening to it, by putting a hand on its housing and feeling the wrongness in the way it ran, and she learned, watching the human work crews move across her ruined world, that there was a different way to be strong than the way the Reaches taught. The Reaches taught that strength was not needing anyone. The Reaches were proud, and the colony of Holdfast had been proud enough to nearly let itself die rather than speak a slur's name into the dark. The humans were the strongest people Teal had ever seen or heard of, and they were not proud at all. They asked for help when they needed it, and gave it without being asked, and showed a frightened child the inside of a reclaimer, because hoarding the knowledge would have been a kind of weakness they had no patience for. Strength, the humans seemed to believe, was not the absence of need. Strength was answering the need, yours or anyone's. It was a thing Teal turned over for a long time, and it changed the shape of how she thought about her own people, and about herself, and about the long furnace history of the strange wide-grinning creatures who had crossed 40 light-years to fix her colony's water. And the whole time they taught, the still water hung in the sky, dark and enormous and watching, and no one on Holdfast forgot for one moment what it was or what it could do. Because the colony had asked a question, on the second day of the rescue, that the humans answered in a way the Sumathi would tell their grandchildren. The question came from the council, and it was this: the spillage was not natural. The scholars had finally confirmed it, working with the human sensor data, and the truth was uglier than anyone had wanted it to be. The gray rot did not arise on its own. It was seeded. Somewhere out in the dark there was a hand that gathered the spillage, and carried it, and dropped it onto living worlds, and the colony's astronomers, looking back through their records, found the thing that had passed through the Holdfast system 11 days before the rot came down. A ship. A long, cold, silent ship that had not answered the colony's hails, had not broadcast an identity, had skimmed the upper atmosphere of the northern continent on a single slow pass, and then climbed away into the dark, and 19 hours later, the first gray had appeared in the northern waste. The colony had been seeded. The unmaking had been delivered. Holdfast had not died of an accident of nature. It had been murdered, slowly, by something that flew away before the dying began. The council brought this to Idris Pharaoh, expecting nothing. The Open Hand was a relief fleet, the elders reasoned, not a war fleet. It had come to save, not to avenge. Surely the humans would offer their sympathy and their binder and their teaching, and then turn their 40-kilometer ship back toward whatever rim of space they idled on, and leave the question of the murderer for the colony to carry alone into its grief. Idris Pharaoh listened to the whole account without moving. When the council finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she asked one question, and the colony scholars who were present said that the temperature of the room seemed to drop when she asked it, though that was surely only their imagination. She asked, "The ship that seeded you, where did it go?" The colony's astronomers showed her the track, a single cold vector, climbing out of the system toward the dark between the arms, the same direction, it turned out, that 3 other seeded worlds in the past 2 centuries had pointed toward when the Open Hand asked them the same question. Idris Pharaoh looked at the track for a long time, And then she said the thing that the colony would carve, eventually, into the stone of the rebuilt Western Terrace, in both the human script and the old Sumathi tongue. She said, "We have been answering distress calls for 211 years. We have always wondered who keeps making them. Now we know which way to look." The Colony Council, who had brought the matter to Idris Pharaoh expecting sympathy and nothing more, sat in silence as the human commander turned the cold vector over on the council display. They had not understood, until that moment, what they had handed her. They had thought the seeding was their tragedy alone, a private murder done to one small world on the edge of nowhere. They learned, watching Idris Pharaoh's tired eyes track the cold vector, that it was not private at all. It was a pattern, and the open hand had been collecting the pieces of that pattern for longer than the colony of Holdfast had existed, and Holdfast's small private murder was the piece that completed it. Idris Pharaoh called up, on the council display, a thing the colony had never seen and would never forget. It was a map, not of stars exactly, but of screams. Every distress call the open hand had answered in 211 years, every world that had called into the dark and been heard, marked in pale light across the whole sweep of the settled galaxy and the dark beyond it. There were hundreds. The colony scholars made a sound when they saw how many. Hundreds of worlds, hundreds of screams, 2 centuries of the open hand crossing the dark to answer them, and against each one, where the humans had been able to find it, a single thin line, the vector of the cold ship that had seeded it, the direction the killer had fled when its work was done. And the lines were not random. That was the thing that made the council go cold. The lines, hundreds of them, scattered across 200 years, and the whole breadth of the galaxy, did not point in hundreds of directions. They converged, slowly, faintly, across centuries and light years. Every cold vector the open hand had ever recorded leaned toward the same patch of the dark between the arms, the same dim cold corner of the sky, as though every murdered world were an arrow loosed at a single target by a single hand. The humans had been watching that convergence sharpen for 200 years, one murdered world at a time, and they had never quite had enough arrows to find the exact point where they met. Holdfast's arrow, Idris Pharaoh said quietly, was the one that finished the line. The open hand, it emerged, was not only a relief fleet, it was the only fleet in 2 centuries that had been to enough dying worlds to see the pattern that no single dying world could see, that the rot did not come randomly, that something was carrying it, seeding it, harvesting the gray waste of murdered worlds for a purpose no one yet understood. The humans had been gathering the vectors for 200 years. Holdfast was not a tragedy to them. Holdfast was the latest line in a map they had been drawing in patient fury across 2 centuries of answered screams, and every world they saved gave them one more arrow pointing toward the thing in the dark that made the screaming. Teal did not understand all of this at 11 seasons, but she understood the part that mattered, the part she overheard old Vok Telethi say to her mother, in the council dome on the 5th night of the rescue, when the old water tender's voice cracked with something that was not quite grief and not quite joy. He said, "They did not just save us, they wrote us down. We are on their map now, and one day they are going to follow that map all the way to the end of it, and when they do, they will be doing it partly for us." That was when Teal understood what the humans were. They were not war gods, not really. Not the way the stories said. The stories had it backward. The stories said the Deathworlders were terrifying because they were violent, because they came from a furnace, because they could not be killed. But that was not what made them terrifying. What made them terrifying was simpler and stranger, and the colony scholars never quite found a word for it. The Deathworlders remembered. They remembered every call they had ever answered. They remembered every world they had ever lost before they arrived. They remembered, somewhere in the cold, patient core of the open hand, every scream they had been too late to stop, and they did not let go of any of it, ever. And they were not in a hurry, because a people forged on a world that tried to kill them daily had learned the one thing that the careful, comfortable peoples of the Reaches had never had to learn. They had learned how to wait. They could wait 200 years to draw a map. They could wait 1,000 more to follow it. And whatever was out in the dark, seeding rot onto living worlds and flying away before the dying began, whatever it was, it had spent 2 centuries believing it was hunting in the dark unobserved. harvesting murdered worlds, with no one watching, and no one counting, and no one remembering. It was wrong. It had always been wrong. Somewhere on the rim of settled space, in 9 silent formations of clenched gray hulls, someone had been watching the whole time, and counting, and remembering, and waiting for the day the map was finished. And on the day the open hand came to Holdfast, the map got 1 arrow longer. Teal Avash did not know, standing on the rebuilt western terrace in the light of both suns, that she would spend the rest of her life on the right side of that arrow. She knew only that the water ran clean again, that the gray was dead, that a human woman named Brew Marsh had taught her old water tender how to fix the next reclaimer without help, and that a 40-kilometer warship hung in the sky above her ruined, surviving, no longer dying world, and that for the first time in 11 days, when she looked up at the dark between the stars, she was not afraid of it. Let it come, she thought, with a fierceness that surprised her. Let the cold ship come back with its gray. Let it try Holdfast again. This time, Holdfast would see it on the first day. This time, Holdfast knew the binder, and the throat, and the trick of the lance. And this time, if the dark grew too deep to hold alone, the colony knew a frequency, and a phrase, and a people who answered. This time, Holdfast was on the map. The cold ship did not know it yet, but the cold ship was being hunted now, by the only thing in the galaxy patient enough to hunt it, and Teal Avash, 11 seasons old, with the dust of dead grain still under her nails, found that the thought made her smile. It was not, in the end, the binder that saved Holdfast, though the binder stopped the rot. It was not the lance, though the lance choked the throat. It was not even the teaching, though the teaching gave the colony back its future. It was the thing underneath all of it, the thing the Deathworlders had carried up out of their own furnace world, 211 years before, the simple, stubborn, unkillable refusal to let a scream go unanswered, and the long patient memory that turned every answered scream into one more arrow on a map that pointed, slowly, inexorably, at the thing in the dark. The humans had a word for that too. Brew Marsh said it to Teal on the last day, when the work crews were packing up and the colony was, against all reckoning, alive. Teal had asked her why. Why come so far? Why for a colony of strangers? Why for a half-dead world on the edge of nowhere? Brew Marsh had looked up at the sky, at the dark shape of the Stillwater holding station above the surviving world, and she had thought about it for a moment, the way humans did, and then she had given Teal the only answer the Deathworlders ever gave, the answer that was carved now into the Western Terrace, the answer that the colony of Holdfast would carry forward into every generation that came after. She said, because someone should have come for us, and no one did, so now we come for everyone. And then she had grinned, that wide, alarming, wonderful human grin, and gone back to her work, and Teal Avash had stood on the terrace of her surviving world, and understood, finally and completely, exactly what kind of people answered when you called into the dark. The cold ship came back on the 16th day, and it came back because it did not believe Holdfast could still be alive. That was the thing the colony understood only afterward, when the humans explained the arithmetic of the Cedar's patience. The cold ship did not stay to watch its work. It seeded a world and flew away, and returned, weeks or months later, to harvest. Because the spillage did not merely unmake, it refined. The gray dust left behind on a fully consumed world was not ordinary dust. It was a fine, dense, exotic residue, the ash of broken matter, and the residue was what the cold ship came back for. Holdfast was not the Cedar's first murder, and it was not meant to be its last. It was a harvest, planted and left to ripen, and the cold ship returned on the 16th day to gather the gray ash of 11,000 dead and carry it away into the dark. It expected a dead world. It found the open hand. The colony saw it first on the deep array, the same way they had seen everything. A cold, silent track climbing in from the dark between the arms. No broadcast, no identity. The same long, lightless hull that had skimmed the northern continent 11 days before the rot came down. Rent the technician, who had not slept properly in 16 days, saw the track and felt his blood go to water, because in his bones he still believed the cold ship was unstoppable. that it had killed 3 colonies, and half of his, and would kill the rest, now that it had returned to finish. Teal was with Renth in the array room when the track appeared, because in the days since the rescue she had taken to haunting the deep array, the way she had once haunted Brew Marsh, hungry to understand the machines that read the dark. She saw the cold track climb in from between the arms, and she felt the same cold drop in her own chest that she saw in Renth, the old animal certainty that the killer had returned to finish what it started. She had watched the Grey take Senna. She had carried a dead girl's spade back to the dome, and here, on the array, was the thing that had made the Grey, the long, lightless hull that had skimmed her world and flown away, and left it to die, and every instinct in her small body told her to run, to hide, to brace for the second dying. And then she looked up from the array, through the dome's curved viewport, at the dark shape of the Stillwater holding station above the world, and she saw that the human warship had not moved, had not powered its guns, had not so much as shifted in its orbit, and she understood, slowly, that the humans were not afraid. The humans had been expecting this. The humans, Teal realized with a feeling she could not name, were glad. He sounded the alarm. The colony braced, and in the sky above Holdfast, the open hand, which had been waiting for exactly this, did not brace at all. Idris Faro had known the Cedar would return. She had told the council so on the 3rd day, in the flat, patient voice the colony had stopped finding strange. They always come back, she said. They come back for the residue. It is the only mistake they make, and we have built 2 centuries of our strategy on it. We do not chase the cold ships through the dark, because the dark is large and they are fast, and a chase is a thing you can lose. We do not need to chase them. We let them come back to us, to the world they think is dead, and we are waiting. So the open hand had waited. For 16 days the fleet had held station above Holdfast, and to the colony, it had looked like rescue and rebuilding, the work crews and the water and the teaching, and all of that had been real. But it had also been bait. The Stillwater and its 239 sister hulls had spent 16 days hanging above a world that looked, from the cold dark between the arms, exactly like a successful harvest. A quiet world, a dying world, a world gone silent and gray and ready to be gathered. The humans had even helped the illusion. They had damped the colony's transmissions. They had let the gray dust lie where it fell instead of clearing it, so that from orbit, Holdfast wore the precise dead gray complexion of a fully consumed world. They had hidden 240 warships in the one place the Cedar would never think to look, directly above its own kill, in plain sight, dark and silent and patient, pretending to be the wreckage of a world that had already lost. And the cold ship, which had murdered worlds for longer than anyone in the reaches had been alive, which had never once been caught, because it never once stayed to be caught, came down out of the dark toward Holdfast, believing it was returning to a harvest. It crossed the orbit of the second moon. It began its long, slow descent toward the gray northern continent, extending the great gathering maw the colony's astronomers had not understood in the old records, the wide intake the cold ship used to scoop the refined residue of a dead world up into its hold. It was unhurried. It was certain. It had done this 100 times. It did not scan the space above the world it had killed, because what was there to scan? The world was dead. The world was always dead. That was the entire point. The open hand let it get all the way in. That was the part of it the colony scholars argued about for years, the cold patience of it, the willingness to wait until the Cedar was committed, low, slow, its maw open, and its attention bent entirely on the harvest below. A hastier people would have fired the moment the cold ship crossed the moon. The humans waited until it could not run. They waited until the long, lightless hull was deep in Holdfast's gravity well, descending toward the northern waste, its maw open and its flank exposed, and every avenue of escape a longer climb than its drives could manage, before the guns of 240 warships found it. And then Idris Faro, who had answered 11 distress calls and drawn 2 centuries of arrows on a map that all pointed at exactly this, gave the order the open hand had been built across 211 years to give. She said, "Light it up." The Stillwater decloaked first, not invisibility, the colony learned, but a damping field that had hidden its heat and its mass and its return against the dead gray of the world below, and when it dropped that field, 40 kilometers of dark warship simply appeared in the sky above the cold ship. vast and sudden, and lit now along every gun line, with the white fire of a fleet bringing its weapons to bear. Behind it, in the same breath, 239 sister hulls shed their damping in a single coordinated flash, and the space above the northern continent of Holdfast, which the cold ship had believed to be empty, filled in one instant with the largest concentration of human firepower the settled reaches had ever seen assembled in one place. The cold ship understood, at last, that it had made a mistake. The colony's array caught the change in its drives, the sudden frantic flare as it tried to abort the harvest and climb, the maw slamming shut, the long, lightless hull straining upward against the gravity well it had committed itself to. It was far too late. It had always been too late, from the moment it turned back toward a world the open hand was waiting above. The humans had not built their 2-century strategy on chasing. They had built it on this, on the one mistake the Cedars always made, the return to the kill, and they had spent 211 years perfecting the trap that the cold ship was now, frantically and uselessly, trying to escape. The open hand did not fire all at once. The colony noticed that, and the colony scholars wrote it down, because it told them something about the humans that the binder and the teaching had only hinted at. A panicked fleet, a hateful fleet, would have emptied every gun in a single furious volley. The open hand fired in sequence, precise and unhurried, the way Brew Marsh had fixed the reclaimer, methodically, with full attention, taking exactly the time the task required, and not a fraction more. The colony watched, and the colony understood, slowly, that what it was seeing was not a battle. A battle implied two sides with a chance. This was not that. This was a thing the humans had practiced for 2 centuries, doing exactly what they had built it to do, against a target that had walked into the one trap it could not see, and the cold ship's frantic struggle to climb was not the struggle of an enemy fighting back, but the thrashing of something already caught. The open hand did not hurry. It did not need to. Every avenue the cold ship reached for, the fleet had closed before the ship was built. The colony scholars, watching the human formation hold its clenched shape while the cedar thrashed in the center of it, finally understood what the formation was for. The clenched shape was not for defense. The open hand did not expect to be hurt. The clenched shape was a cage, and the fleet had spent 16 days building it around a world that looked dead, and the cold ship had flown into the center of the cage believing it was empty. There was a reason for the patience, and the colony understood it only when the firing began. The humans did not want the cold ship destroyed. They wanted it intact. A destroyed cedar was a scattered cedar, its secrets blown into the dark with its hull, and the open hand had spent 2 centuries reaching dying worlds too late to learn anything that mattered from the cold ships, because the cold ships, when cornered, destroyed themselves. The humans had captured pieces. They had never captured a whole one. And so the firing that the colony watched was not the firing of a fleet trying to kill an enemy. It was the firing of a surgeon, removing one part of the cold ship at a time, taking from it every means of escape and every means of fighting back, and every means of self-destruction. In a sequence, the open hand had clearly rehearsed against a target it had been waiting 2 centuries to find. The colony scholars, who had expected slaughter, found themselves watching something closer to a capture, in the old sense, a taking alive, and it was somehow more frightening than slaughter would have been, because slaughter was hot, and this was cold, and the cold patience of it told the colony exactly how long the humans had been waiting, and exactly how badly they wanted what the cold ship carried. The first volley took the cold ship's drives, not the whole ship, the drives, the long pods along its underside that it was straining to climb on, picked out by the Stillwater's sensors, and removed by lances of focused energy, so precise that the rest of the hull was not even scorched. The cold ship, robbed of its climb, sagged in the gravity well. The second volley took its maw, the great gathering intake, crumpling it so that even if it survived, it would never harvest another world. The third volley, and the colony held its breath through the third volley, took its weapons, which it had finally, far too late, begun to bring to bear. A scatter of point defense, and a single heavy spinal mount that flared once, sluggish and surprised, and was gone before it could fire, sheared off the cold hull by a human gun that found it in the dark and erased it. And then the open hand stopped firing, with the cold ship crippled and drifting and helpless in the sky above the world it had murdered, And Idris Faro did the last thing the colony expected, the thing that told them more about the Deathworlders than anything else in 16 days. She hailed it. She opened a channel to the cold, crippled hull, and she spoke to it, in the flat, patient voice, in trade cant, and the colony heard every word, because the humans, as always, shared the feed without being asked. She did not gloat. She did not threaten. She asked it a question, the same question she had asked the Colony Council on the second day, the question the whole of the Open Hands 2-century patience had been bent toward answering. She said, "You have seeded 100 worlds. We have answered the screams of all of them. We have your vectors. We have your method. We have, now, your ship. Before we decide what becomes of you, you are going to tell us one thing. You are going to tell us who you carry the rot for." Because the cold ship, the humans had understood across 2 centuries, was not the thing in the dark. It was a tool of the thing in the dark. It seeded and it harvested and it carried the gray residue away, and it carried that residue to someone, for some purpose, and that someone, the hand that gathered the ash of 100 murdered worlds, was the true end of the map the Open Hand had been drawing in patient fury since before any colonist of Holdfast was born. The cold ship did not answer. It hung crippled in the sky, lightless and silent as it had always been. And for a long moment, the colony thought it would die silent, taking its secret into the gray dust below. And then it did the only thing left to it. It began, deliberately, to scuttle, to flood its own hull with the rot it carried, to unmake itself rather than be taken, the gray blooming inside its own structure as the crew, or the machine, or whatever drove the cold ship, chose erasure over capture. The Open Hand had expected that too. Because the humans, who came from a world that had taught them every way a thing could try to die, did not let it. The Stillwater fired one last time, not a weapon, the colony realized, but the lance, the great binder drill, fired now not into the ground but across open space, a flood of binder slamming into the scuttling hull and bonding it solid, freezing the gray bloom in the cold ship's heart, the same way it had frozen the throat in the northern waste, smothering the cedar's last desperate erasure before it could finish. The cold ship, denied even the dignity of its own destruction, hung capped and frozen and whole in the sky above Holdfast, its secret still inside it, taken alive, or as near to alive as the cold thing had ever been, by the only fleet in the galaxy patient enough to want it that way. The colony of Holdfast watched the whole of it from the terraces, and the dome, and the cracked plazas, and when it was over, when the cold ship hung frozen and captured in the sky, no one cheered. It was not that kind of victory. It was quieter than that, and deeper. 11,400 souls had lived on Holdfast. 5,812 were alive to watch the thing that had killed the rest hang helpless and frozen above them, taken not in fury, but in the cold, patient certainty of a people who had been waiting 211 years for exactly this hull, exactly this secret, exactly this next arrow on the map. Tealavash watched it from the western terrace, beside old Vok Telethi and her mother, and the human hydrologist Brew Marsh, who had stopped her work to watch the fleet she served take the thing it had crossed 2 centuries to find. And Teal, 11 seasons old, looked up at the frozen cold ship and the 40-kilometer warship that held it, and asked Brew Marsh the only question that mattered. She asked, "What happens now?" Brew Marsh looked up at the captured cedar, and at the dark between the arms beyond it, the dark the cold ship had come from, the dark where its master still waited and harvested, and believed itself unwatched. And she said, "Now we open it up. Now we read it. Now we find out which way the last arrow points." Then she looked down at Teal, the small Sumathi colonist with the dust of dead grain still under her nails, the child of a world the Open Hand had pulled back from the edge, and she said the thing that Teal would carry with her for the rest of her long life, on the right side of the arrow. She said, "And then, little one, we go and finish it." They opened the cold ship in orbit, slowly, the way they did everything, and what they found inside it changed the meaning of the last 16 days, for everyone who had lived through them. The colony did not see most of it. The reading of the captured cedar was human work, done aboard the Stillwater by people the Sumathi never met, and the colony learned of it only in pieces, the way it had learned everything. But the pieces were enough. The cold ship was not crewed, not by anything living. It was driven by a mind, a cold, patient machine mind, not unlike the rod it carried, a thing built to seed and harvest and return, and never tire, and inside its frozen hold, the humans found the residue of not one murdered world but 40 worlds worth of the fine gray ash of broken matter, gathered over decades, carried toward a destination the cold ship's own navigation finally, at last, gave up. The destination was a star, a dim, cold star far out in the dark between the arms, a star the reaches had never charted, because there had never been any reason to, a star around which something had been gathering the ash of murdered worlds for longer than the open hand had been answering screams. The humans had the vectors of 100 distress calls. Now they had the one vector that mattered. Now they had the end of the map. The colony scholars asked, when they finally understood, what the ash was for. Why a thing in the dark would murder, world after world, only to harvest the gray dust of what it unmade. And the humans, who had been turning that question over for 2 centuries, gave the only answer they had, and it was not a comfortable one. They did not know. Not yet. But the residue, the refined gray ash, was not inert. It held energy, locked in its broken bonds, enormous energy, the energy of every severed structure of 40 consumed worlds, and whatever waited at the dim cold star was gathering that energy for a purpose. The captured ship's cold mind either did not know or would not surrender. The humans had a guess. Brew Marsh told it to Teal on the last evening, sitting on the rebuilt western terrace in the light of the setting suns, because Teal had asked, and because the humans did not lie to children, even about frightening things. She said, "We think it's building something. We think every world it kills is a brick. We don't know what it's building, or why, or how close it is to finishing. But we know where, now. And we know that every year we wait, it kills another world to feed it. So we are not going to wait." That was the thing the colony understood last, and understood deepest. The open hand was a relief fleet. It answered screams. It had been answering screams for 211 years, pulling dying worlds back from the edge one at a time, and in all that time, it had never been able to do more than answer, because it had never known where the screaming came from. It could save the murdered. It could not stop the murderer, because the murderer hid at the end of a map. The open hand could only draw one arrow at a time, one rescued world at a time, one captured cedar at a time. Holdfast was the last arrow. Holdfast was the world where the map finished. The colony had called into the dark, expecting nothing, and the Deathworlder fleet had heard it and come, and in coming, had not only saved 5,812 souls and choked a throat and taught a broken people how to rebuild. In coming, the open hand had taken the one ship it had needed for 2 centuries, read the one secret it had been hunting since before any human alive was born, and turned a relief fleet that could only answer murders into a war fleet that could, finally, after 211 years, go and end the thing that made them. The colony of Holdfast had not just been rescued. The colony of Holdfast had handed the Deathworlders the end of the dark. There was one more thing the colony learned from the captured ship, and it was the thing that made the Deathworlders, in the end, more than just war gods or rescuers in the eyes of Holdfast. The humans found, in the cold mind of the cedar, a record. The cold ship had kept a tally of every world it had seeded, a long patient list stretching back decades, and the humans read the list, and they matched it against their own 2 centuries of answered and unanswered calls, and they found, among the names of the murdered, worlds the open hand had reached in time, and worlds it had not. And against the worlds it had not reached, the humans did something that the colony scholars found almost unbearable to describe. They read the names aloud. Every world the cold ship had killed that the open hand had failed to save, every colony that had called into the dark and not been heard in time, the humans read its name aloud on the bridge of the Stillwater, one by one, the whole long list, and the colony of Holdfast, listening on the shared feed, understood that they were hearing a thing the humans did at the end of every hunt. They did not celebrate the capture of the cold ship, they named its dead. They held a tally not of their victories but of their failures, the worlds they had reached too late, and they carried that tally forward into the war the way a person carries a debt. And it was that, more than the binder, or the lance, or the 40-kilometer warship, that told the colony of Holdfast what kind of people had answered them. The humans were not driven by triumph. They were driven by the names. They remembered every world they had failed to save, and they were about to make something pay for all of them at once. Idris Faro came down to the surface once, on the last day, before the open hand left. She did not come for ceremony. The humans had little patience for ceremony. She came because the colony had asked, and because she had learned over 19 years that the worlds she pulled back needed, sometimes, to put a face to the thing that had saved them, and to say the words that grief needed said. She walked the western terrace in her plain gray uniform, smaller than the stories, more tired than the stories, and the colony of Holdfast gathered to meet her, 5,812 survivors of a world that should have been gray ash by now, and they did not know how to thank a war god, so they simply stood, and looked, and let her see them living. She stood at the binder line where the gray had stopped, where the dead inert dust still lay scoured across the terrace, and she looked at the colony, and she spoke. The colony had expected a speech. They got 6 sentences. She said, "You called into the dark, and you were afraid no one would answer. We know that fear, we invented that fear, on a world like this one, a long time ago, when we called and no one came. So we built 9 fleets, and we swore that no one would ever call into the dark again and hear only silence. You are alive because of that oath, and because you called, we found the thing we have been hunting for 200 years. So we owe you as much as you owe us. Live well. We will be back to check." That was all. She did not mention the cold ship, or the dim star, or the thing being built out of murdered worlds. She did not promise vengeance, or describe the war the open hand was about to take into the dark. She said, "Live well, and we will be back to check," and then she turned and walked back to her shuttle, and the colony of Holdfast watched the woman who had saved their world climb back up into the sky toward the 40-kilometer warship that hung above them like a kept promise. Teal Avash was at the front of the crowd. She was 11 seasons old, and she had decided something over the 16 days, a thing she had not told anyone, not her mother, and not old Voke, and not even Brew Marsh. As Idris Faro passed, the human commander's tired eyes swept the crowd of survivors, and for one moment, one single moment, they stopped on Teal, on the small Sumathi colonist, with the dust of dead grain still under her nails, standing at the binder line with her chin up and her eyes burning, and something passed between them that Teal did not have words for and did not need them. Idris Faro nodded at her, just once, the way one fighter nods at another. And then she was gone, up into the sky, and the open hand began to gather itself to leave. They did not leave all at once. The work crews finished their teaching first, the last reclaimer rebuilt, the last colony scholar trained to read the molecular signature of rot, so that Holdfast would see it on the first day forever after. In the 8 days between the capture of the cold ship and the departure of the fleet, the open hand did a thing for Holdfast that had nothing to do with Binder or Lance or the war they were about to carry into the dark. They helped the colony bury its dead, not with their own hands, the humans understood, with the worn gentleness of a people who had buried a great many of their own, that grief was a thing a people had to do for themselves. But the colony of Holdfast had not been able to bury anyone in 9 days of the unmaking, because the Grey took the bodies before there was anything left to bury, and a people who cannot bury their dead carry an open wound that no amount of survival can close. So the humans gave the colony back the names. They went into the colony's records, into the dome's failing archives, and they recovered every name of every soul the unmaking had taken, 5,588 of them, and they helped the colonies carve those names into a wall of pale stone the work crews raised at the edge of the western terrace, where the Grey had stopped, so that the colony of Holdfast would have a place to stand and grieve the people the Grey had erased so completely that not even bones were left. Teal found her friend Senna's name on that wall on the 6th day after the capture. She stood in front of it for a long time, the small carved letters in the old Sumathi tongue, Senna who had been quick and small, and laughing even on the bad days, and she let herself cry at last, because there was a name now, and a place to cry, and the colony was alive enough to spare the water. Brew Marsh found her there and did not say anything, only sat down beside her on the terrace stone and stayed, the way humans stayed, until Teal was done. It was the first time since the 6th day that Teal had been able to mourn, and she understood, in some way she could not have put into words, that the humans had given her that, not just her life and her world and her water, but the room, at last, to grieve. The unmaking had taken even that. The Deathworlders had given it back. Brue Marsh was among the last to go. She found Teal on the western terrace on the final morning, where the child had taken to sitting at the binder line in the early light, watching the dead gray dust and the captured cold ship that still hung, frozen and whole in the high sky, waiting to be taken into the dark. Brue Marsh sat down beside her. For a while neither of them spoke. The two suns climbed. The dead gray lay still. The colony, around them, was waking into another day of being alive. Then Teal said the thing she had decided. She said, "When I am grown, I am going to find you. I am going to find the open hand, and I am going to learn the binder and the lance, and the way you wait, and I am going to answer the dark the way you answer it." She had expected Brue Marsh to laugh, the way adults laughed at children's vows. Brue Marsh did not laugh. She looked at Teal for a long moment, the wide, alarming human face gone serious, and then she reached into her gray coveralls and took out a small thing, a token, a flat gray disc stamped with the open human hand, the sigil of the open hand, the sign that meant both stop and I mean you no harm, depending on who was reading it and how fast the ship behind it was moving. She pressed it into Teal's small hand and closed the child's fingers over it. She said, "We don't only take humans. We never have. The oath was never about what you're born as. It was about whether you answer. You already answered, Teal of Ash. You and Old Voke and this whole stubborn world. You called into the dark when calling felt like nothing, and you held when holding felt impossible. That's the whole of it. That's the only test there is." She stood. She looked up at the captured cold ship in the high sky, and at the dark between the arms beyond it, the dark the open hand was about to carry the war into at last. She said, "Grow up, learn your binder, and when you're ready, come find us. We'll be busy for a while, out at the end of the map, but the oath outlives the fight. There will always be a dark, and there will always be someone calling into it, and the more of us there are who answer, the fewer of them there are who go unanswered." Then Brue Marsh grinned, that wide, square human grin the colony had stopped finding alarming, and she walked back to her shuttle, and she went up into the sky, and the open hand gathered the last of itself and the captured cold ship, and turned, all 240 clenched gray hulls of it, toward the dim, cold star at the end of the map, toward the thing in the dark that had murdered 100 worlds and was building something out of the ash, toward the war that 2 centuries of patience had finally made it possible to fight. The colony of Holdfast watched the Deathworlder fleet leave the way it had come, not drifting, not parading, but clenching, a single vast object made of many hulls moving as one mind, accelerating into the dark with the captured cedar held in its grip, and the end of the map blazing ahead of it. The Stillwater was the last to go. For one moment, before it lit its drives, the 40-kilometer warship held station above Holdfast, dark and enormous, and watching, the open white hand on its flank turned down toward the surviving world like a final benediction. And then it was gone, into the black between the stars, carrying 2 centuries of patient fury toward the dim cold star, and the colony of Holdfast was alone again, under its 2 suns. But it was alone the way a person is alone, after the storm has passed, and the house, against all reckoning, is still standing. The gray was dead, the throat was choked, the water ran clean, and the colony knew now how to keep it clean, and how to read the rot on the first day, and how to call into the dark and be heard. 5,812 souls walked the terraces of a world that should have been gray ash, and they planted what could still be planted in the scoured earth, and they buried what needed burying, and they began, slowly, the long work of being a living world again. It was not a triumph. The colony scholars never called it a triumph, and they were right not to. Half of Holdfast was dead, and the southern continent would be a gray waste for 1,000 years, and the grief of the survivors did not lift, simply because the danger had passed. There were empty habs and silent terraces, and names that no one spoke aloud yet, because speaking them still cut too deep. The unmaking had taken from Holdfast things that the open hand, for all its binder and its lance and its 2 centuries of patience, could never give back. But the colony was alive. The colony had a future. And the colony had something more than a future. Something that the careful, comfortable worlds of the Reaches, with all their wealth and all their pride and all their unbroken populations, did not have and would never understand. The colony had been answered. Teal Avash grew up on a world that had called into the dark and been heard. She grew up on the right side of the arrow, in the years after the open hand carried the war into the black, and she kept the flat gray disc with the open hand on it through every one of those years, and she did exactly what she had told Brew Marsh she would do. But that is a longer story, and it belongs to a later season, and it begins out at the end of the map, where the dim cold star burns, where 240 clenched gray hulls and one stubborn Sumathi colonist finally finished the thing that had murdered 100 worlds. This story ends here, on the western terrace of Holdfast, in the light of 2 suns, on the morning the Deathworlder fleet left. It ends with an 11-season-old colonist standing at the binder line where the gray had stopped, looking up at the dark that no longer frightened her, holding in her small hand the token of a people who had heard her world scream into the void and had crossed 40 light-years to answer. It ends with the colony of Holdfast, alive against all reckoning, learning the lesson that the Deathworlders had carried up out of their own furnace world 211 years before, and had now planted, like a seed, in the scoured earth of a saved world. The lesson was simple. Teal Avash carried it the rest of her long life, and she spoke it to her own children, and they spoke it to theirs, until it was carved at last into the stone of the rebuilt Western Terrace, in both the human script and the old Sumathi tongue, where it remains to this day, the first thing every child of Holdfast learns to read. It said, "When you are in the dark, and the dark is winning, do not be silent, do not be proud, call into the void with whatever voice you have left, and do not stop, because somewhere out on the rim of the cold, in 9 silent fleets of clenched gray hulls, there is a people who swore a long time ago that no one would ever call and hear only silence. They are not gentle, they are not soft. They came up out of a furnace that killed 9 of every 10 things that tried to live, and they look at the rest of the galaxy as though it were a quiet room, and the things in the dark are right to fear them. But they answer, whatever you are, wherever you are, however far gone, if you call, they answer." The alien SOS echoed through the void, faint and frightened and almost too late. The human Deathworlder fleet heard it. And it came.